watched last night's debate, I'm sure.
I did.
How does that sense that we experienced in 9/11 uh, evolve into the discussion of Americans' borders and immigration policy? Do you make a connection? I was both disgusted and amused by the responses and the vitriol from former President Donald Trump, particularly accusing Vice President Kamala Harris about dropping the ball at the border. But that plus his statements about Haitians,
Yeah.
all of that adds up to racialization uh, as a policy that he represents. What are your thoughts?
Yes, he became very hostile during the debate, and his position on wanting a wall and his accusations about immigrants were completely inflammatory. Um, I wrote down that he said that, these people are leaving prisons, leaving jails, insane asylums. And then he returned to the accusation of taking jobs from African Americans. And then, of course, Haitian immigrants will eat your pets, they'll eat your cats and dogs. To the point that actually one of the moderators had to say, no one is eating anyone's pets.
And he said he saw it on television. So it must be
Exactly.
true, right? Yeah, it
It
was really
must be it
crazy.
must be true.
Well, let's take a few minutes and sort of walk through the debate last night as you saw it, and I can share what my thoughts were. I've been watching the reports all night long. I sat up and watched Roland Martin, and
Okay.
he had members of the CBC on doing a post-debate analysis. He had one set, and then another set that didn't stay because it went long. Then he
Mhm.
had his regular people, Dr. Greg Carr, and who else was there? Um, People I know from their faces but not all their names responded to the debate. I've watched the shows this morning, and the sense is that Kamala Harris did a marvelous job of announcing herself, presenting herself, defining herself to people that she might not have been, really well known by. All the news had been people didn't really know Kamala Harris. They knew her as the number two person on the Biden ticket, but they didn't have a picture of her and her voice. The reports last night and this morning seem to suggest that she really presented herself in a way that was both elegant, refreshing, clear, comprehensive, and confidence building. She showed herself capable of managing and uh, communicating
Mhm.
her ideas, and even in the face of the vitriol that we saw uh, Donald Trump present. What were your thoughts on that?
I think that the ultimate goal for her was to present herself as presidential, and
Mm.
she did that. She had a commanding presence. She had extraordinary knowledge. I thought her answer about the questions about Ukraine were
Mhm.
spot on. She was able to show the country that she actually has been in the Situation Room. She's familiar with working with NATO. She had a very clear position, whereas former President Donald Trump would not say that he was supporting Ukraine to win the war. He also tried to say that she was aligned with Putin, and she was able to dismiss that by saying that she's actually never met Putin. And so I think that she did well for people who have not been exposed to her positions on foreign affairs, that she actually has been very involved in global politics, because that's not necessarily the role of the vice president, but she has a track record. And so I thought that was very important.
She also addressed the question of Palestine and Israel, and I believe President Trump attempted to paint her as a person who hated Jews and the
Right,
Israelis, and he also said she also hates Arabs, and
right.
but his whole idea was disinformation, uh, and dissing. Um, but she turn that around like, nothing. What were your thoughts when she did that and when he did
Well,
that?
I thought she was able to turn it around so quickly because it's not based in anything that's actually accurate. So he
Mhm.
came right out and said that she was anti-Israel, and he's doing that to try to cultivate the Jewish vote. But it does not take into account many important things. First and foremost, we all know that her spouse of 10 years is Jewish.
Mhm.
And when we had the Democratic National Convention, she had the parents of the Israeli hostages speak forth. Not only that, less than 2 weeks after they spoke out, sadly, their son was killed.
Mhm.
And so there's no way that anyone could say that she was anti-Israel.
Mhm. So that was one that and I think she properly talked about his worship of dictators in the world.
Right,
And
right.
and I think one of her lines was, you're cozying up to Putin, but he's
Mhm.
going to eat you for lunch. I thought that
Right.
was a great zinger. What do you think about that?
I mean, I thought that was fantastic, particularly since he tried to say that Putin was supporting Harris partly because Putin was threatened by Trump. And history tells us that that is not what is true. History tells us that they have been in collaboration for years.
She, I think, systematically accused him or revealed him or charged or pointed out all of his failings and all
Mhm,
of his character failings, but she did it kind of one by one with scenarios around it. So she talked about him being a weak person. She
mhm,
talked about him being selfish, about him being not interested in the Constitution or the rule of law. She talked about, one by one, his uh, racist
mhm,
history when she went into the fact that he grew up as a landlord and who
mhm,
was charged as a landlord with racial discrimination against black and brown people. Then she moved into his policies as a businessman that were anti-black. And then
mhm,
she moved into the statements he made, the purchase of a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for the death, the execution of the Central Park Five, young men
mhm.
falsely accused, falsely convicted, and finally exonerated. And even though exonerated, he would always go on to say they committed the crime, he believed that they did it, and they should have been killed. And he didn't seem to show any remorse that they had been found innocent. So she was able to point that out point by point, chapter and verse. I
Mhm.
thought that was very effective.
I mean, it was effective because she put him in a position where he actually would not express any regret about January 6th. And that was one of the questions from the moderators. She was also able to remind people about Charlottesville, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can have amnesia about these things. And so if it didn't happen yesterday, it
Mm-hmm.
might not be on many people's minds. But when Charlottesville happened and the people came out with tiki torches and they were making anti-Semitic remarks.
Mm-hmm.
His response when he was the sitting president was that there were good people on each side. She also reminded people about the Proud Boys. And so all of these things, even though they're recent history, there's so much going on in people's lives that I thought it was important that she tied these things together. I do not think that he was successful in trying to blame Nancy Pelosi for January 6th. I think even Republicans and undecided people would not have understood January 6th like that. I think one of the issues that was going on with the debate is that you can support different policy issues, right? Half the country is Republican. That's perfectly fine. I think one of the dilemmas was the fact that we had some issues with facts. And so it's one thing to disagree about the economy, to disagree about how the pandemic was handled, but we're acting like some of these things weren't only 4 years ago, and that we have all the data to go back and say this is how things actually unfolded.
I thought it was fascinating, Duchess, that he kind of wanted to imply that 70 million Americans had, voted him in, and that
Right.
he
And
had been
she
the top
said,
vote
yeah,
getter
she
of
said that
all
81
time.
million Americans fired him.
Fired. Yeah,
Right?
I thought
And,
that was,
you know,
yeah.
I don't think he was expecting that, particularly someone that spent a great deal of his career saying, "You've gotten fired." She turned that on him and said, "You were actually fired."
Hmm. That plus her critique. She said, "Oh, let me do something different. I'm going to invite all of you." She's looking at the audience, right, to go to a Trump rally. I said, "What? What's this?"
Right.
And then she went and basically undressed the rally as boring, disinteresting, and a place where people, after a while, because they were tired, would leave early. You know, and that triggered him. That got him. And
It
what the
really
com?
did.
Go ahead.
It really did, but I also think there's some value, even though I think she was trying to bait him, of course.
Hmm.
But I think there's some value in suggesting that people see what the other side is doing. So, for instance, to prepare for this interview, I was watching Fox News this morning, and I was
Hmm.
watching Fox News because I need to know what their arguments are and what they're saying. And I need to know just what their perception is of both of them as a candidate, and where I see facts and where I'm concerned that there might not be facts.
Well, give us an update. What did you take away from the news channels that you monitored this morning?
I mean, I thought it was really interesting that I really could see a lot of bias, right? I could see that the more left leaning channels were incredibly celebratory around the vice president. Fox, of course, has determined that former President Trump won, and that he had the upper hand and more integrity. Their biggest argument about Vice President Harris is that she hasn't stated her positions, which I really do not understand that assessment, that anyone that watched that for 90 minutes. She was perfectly clear about her position on abortion, which
Hmm.
means she's distanced herself from President Biden, who is a
Hmm.
Catholic, who didn't even like using the word abortion.
Hmm.
And she put Trump in a position that he did not want to weigh in on abortion, and backtracked some of the things that he had said previously. And so she was very strong with that. She was strong by letting the audience know that he invited the Taliban to
Hmm.
David. And I think that if you're not following these things every single day, that might have been something that you did not know.
And I
Um,
didn't know that. I just didn't remember it. I just wasn't.
Right, right,
Yeah.
and so that to me was very important, that, she allowed anyone who was participating in this to actually have information, and her information was accurate. People on Fox were saying that she wasn't fact checked, but she had facts, where he was fact checked 5 times, and out of those 5 times, he was off base.
Which were the ones that he was checked on? Do you remember?
I mean, definitely. I mean, one of the ones is that he was saying that people were executing babies, and that people who were in favor of reproductive rights, that include after the child was delivered, and
Yeah.
that infants were being executed, was the word that he used. And I mean, that's completely inaccurate. There isn't a hospital in the United States of America that's killing infants.
Mhm. One of the comments, I'm not sure if it was after the debate on one of the talk shows, maybe it was on Roland Martin, where someone monitoring maybe Twitter put a post up saying that his claim that Democrats were allowing aborting children after they were born. And the
Right.
comment was killing a child after they're born amounts to school shootings. Right. That
Wow.
was classic and
Wow.
wonderful because he's been touting and promoting, freedom for Second Amendment and gun rights, and that sort of despite all the killings that are
Right,
mass killings in our
right.
country, many, but also in schools. That was good. And I thought it was great too that she said, Joe and I, no, not Joe. She said,
Tim Walz, her and
Tim
Tim
and I
Walz.
are
Yeah,
gun owners, right?
right,
So we're not talking about taking
right.
anybody's guns away, talking about sensible gun policy.
And that's something that there were people last night that did not know that she was a gun owner, even though she has said that previously. And I think Tim Walz has done a good job by letting people know that he has been an avid hunter his entire life. And
Mhm.
there's a difference between a hunting rifle and the kind of weaponry that just happened last week on the first day of school. You have a teenager going in to a school and killing 4 people. And that's not with a hunting rifle. That's with an assault rifle. And those are different things.
Mhm. The other thing that I thought about in that area uh, of gun violence was another thought that I had. It's slipped away right now. But I thought altogether just a great presentation and performance and leadership. So,
Mm,
what the commentators on the Black community last night were saying was that we believe we've witnessed the coming forth of the
mhm,
first woman president, the first African American woman president in the history of our country. And there was a round table, and over the course, they all kind of came to that conclusion that this debate, this performance, kind of affirmed and is revealing what's about to happen. They also were careful to say we can't take anything for granted, that
right,
work still must be done.
right.
But the question of it being a likelihood was established firmly, and a desirability was established firmly in her display of what leadership sounds like, looks like.
Mhm,
Because again and again and again, she talked about uh, how do we approach problem solving? How do we present ourselves as problem solvers? And that as a common characteristic of all of the people of the
right,
country. And she invites all of them to be participants and partners in problem solving. That, in comparison to Donald Trump's continued uh, uh, blasting the country itself, saying the country is in decline and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. He was so pessimistic and so hell bent on describing that if he is not elected, America as we know it is going to be torn apart. Uh, and you know, at what point in time does that kind of rhetoric become too much even for the people that support him? Or is it that that many people really fully believe the way he's describing? Is he simply reflecting the fear of the, what, 70 or so million people that voted for him? What do you think?
I respect the excitement that Congressional Black Caucus might have, but my concern is that it's still too early.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we know is that Hillary was ahead, and she was ahead this time out and at every moment from this moment up until the week before the election. And then people started talking about her emails, and then Trump won. And so I think that we need to be cautious about saying that, we have just witnessed a performance of possibly the first Black Asian woman president of the United States, because there's still so much more to come. And, we also do not know how this is going to play out with different generations. And so we spoke earlier about Israel, but I know that Generation Z is not excited about her positions about Palestine, even though last night she spoke about the humanity and the dignity of Palestinians. I
Mm-hmm.
think that younger voters think that she's too close to Biden's stance around Israel, and they don't really value that. I think that also there are younger voters that are concerned about the climate, and people who think that she hasn't maintained one position on the climate, even though last night she said that she has. And so I just still think there's so much going on that I don't know if we can call it yet.
She did talk about, and she came out slugging, and I think talking about jobs, about housing, and about small business. She said she is proposing to create a resource that enables small businesses to take a $50,000 tax break for starting a small business. That's significant with the intent of encouraging small business development. She talked about uh, housing, creating a program that would give first-time home buyers a $25,000 gift to
Yeah.
enable them to get into a down payment in a home. And she talked about creating new jobs. I think she indicated that the job creation experience of her administration far exceeded any other administration and was on track to continue. So I thought she came out declaring program and policy and intent. And
Mhm.
so it kind of
Mhm.
is disconcerting then to see the other side say she didn't talk about policy, whereas
Exactly. I agree with you with that.
whereas Donald Trump did not speak about any of those things. He simply kept
Right.
talking about how great and how big and how fast and how wonderful, but generalities that were empty and meaningless. And apparently, what he's learned is that that's kind of what his base wants to hear
Mhm.
is a generality from which they can deduce, their own details. And the
Right.
details at the end of the day end up being inconsequential because there's an intent. What
Mhm.
is the intent? Well, I think the intent is to tell them that your whiteness really is on the table. And the privilege that you expected, that you were groomed to believe you had, is now at risk. And that the other side, meaning those who call themselves progressives or the Democratic
Mhm.
Party, the
Mhm.
people who are not you,
Mhm.
don't want to recognize or value or honor what you think you lined up for and signed up for, and what you think may be at risk. Therefore, he's rallying them in their fear in hopes
Sure.
that they will resist. That was what January 6th was all about. What do you
Sure.
think?
Sure. I mean, I agree with so much of that. That she was talking about policy, which is why I did not understand what I saw on Fox News this morning. The only concern with any of that is, to paraphrase James Baldwin, it isn't what happens when you get a black president in America. It is what America does with a black president, right? And so part of it is if she did get elected,
Mhm.
would she have the Congress and the Senate to give $50,000 tax cut to small business owners? Would you get a $6,000 tax break if you had a child? Would those things be able to happen? Would she able to make gains with the housing crisis? That's part of the concern with this, right? That we have three branches of government. We have six conservative Supreme Court justices, and so I think that she laid out policy that is clear. If she were elected, could she get those things done? I am not sure. One of the reasons why I say that is that Obama was the only sitting president that wasn't able to get a Supreme Court justice. He put Garland forward, and then they wouldn't approve it. And then Trump becomes president, and now we have the most conservative Supreme Court that we've had in our lifetime.
And they fast tracked his three
Yeah,
appointments, I think,
yeah,
and but with an intent. And the same thing was happening with all of his lower court appointments, attempting to stack and rewrite the story of election access
yeah.
around the
And
country. And that's
and
what
a
we have to
lot of
fear, I
people
think.
Yeah, and a lot of people do not want to acknowledge how many federal judges he got in, right? Because,
Mhm.
most people aren't paying attention to that. But he
Mhm.
was able to impact the federal judiciary throughout the entire nation, which is partly between that and then the Dobbs ruling. That had a tremendous impact on this country.
What did you think about his kind of like bragging? Because she mentioned that he had X number of indictments
Hmm.
and not indictments, but he'd been found guilty
Mhm.
So
Mm,
his argument that is he's going to be appealing all of those, and he acts as though for him it's a fait accompli that
mhm.
all of those charges will be dropped or found to uh, be reversed by
Sure.
lowercase appellate courts. But there was a certain cockiness in his statement that he has already proved the world knows that all those things are going to go away. How did
Yeah.
you feel about that?
I witnessed the hubris as well,
Mhm.
and, what I was thinking was the people who support him believe that it was all political. They believe and that he has, sold that, and he has sold it with a lot of confidence that this has only happened because of partisanship, and when Republicans, are back in power, these things will go away. So this is his argument of bias.
Hmm.
And, I might not agree with it, but I have to say it is effective.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And so uh, it didn't come up last night, but what's in the back of my mind all the time is discussions I've had with my friends and colleagues about the 70 million people that
Yeah,
voted for him. And my fear is what I am taking from the dog whistling that he does all the time, suggesting that if he is not able to prevail, in his words, there'd be a bloodbath.
sure.
And that, and so then people are start talking about, well, they're talking about some kind of armed insurrection. Well, then was January 6th a trial run? Was it practice? Or what is it? And do we actually think that there are enough malcontent, discontent, or even true believers, let's give them benefit of the doubt,
Mhm,
who believe that their sense of democracy and their place in it is at risk, and
mhm.
therefore they are prepared to bear arms against other Americans. Who are the other Americans? We could say loosely, generally, broadly, the 81 million who fired him. But you
Sure.
could say, really, our history tells us that our people, Black people, become the brunt and the symbol of change and of what white nationalists fear
Mhm,
and,
mhm.
and have demonstrated their ability to visit with violence and with legislative uh, uh, murder as well. What do you think about that?
This is why I'm cautious, right? So I understand the excitement of most Black Americans. Most Black Americans of my generation did not think in their lifetime that they would see a candidate like Vice President Kamala Harris. And people did not think that up until the day that it was announced. And so I understand that. But when the moderators asked last night about the transfer of power, this is what makes me cautious, right? We have already seen the violence. And so, one thing I want us to think about is that
What did he say? I can't remember exactly. I remember the question, but I don't
he
remember
well
if he answered the question or not.
acted he of course he did not answer the question, but in not answering the question, it was partly, but how could I not win? Like that was his stance.
That's
And
right.
so, I don't even have a concern about the transfer of power. But this is a moment for us to go back to even the Reconstruction era.
Mhm,
So my dear friend and colleague is Jelani Cobb, who is the dean of the School of Journalism at Columbia University. And he gave a talk at McAllister in 2016, the Friday before the Tuesday election. And
mhm.
he predicted that there was going to be Obama backlash. You can imagine that because McAllister is left leaning, people in the audience did not particularly want to hear that. And less than a week later, we all understood that Trump had won. Well, Jelani is trained by David Levering Lewis, who won a Pulitzer for his biography of Du Bois, right? He is a historian. And what he knows is that when Black Americans make gains, shortly after that, you get the lowest point, which is why you talk about Reconstruction as the nadir, the lowest point. So Black Americans were delighted that emancipation happened. No one really predicted how difficult Reconstruction would be, right? We were delighted with civil rights and Black power. No one could predict the pushback from Reagan Bush. And so once again, if Vice President Harris wins, I am sure the majority of Black Americans will be delighted. Will there be smooth transition of power? Well, Biden's ready to hand it over, but what do we do with the Trump supporters? And I think that if we don't consider that, we are kidding ourselves.
So what does history tell us? I mean, let's go back
History,
through those things.
history tells us that this could possibly be violent, and I want people to know that I'm not coming at that as a pessimist. I'm coming at that as someone that has done this academic work for 3 decades.
And so if it could be violent, how would that show up? What would be the how would you both note it or be able to notice it, predict it, or protect yourself from it? So I grew up, Duchess, in the era where we were talking about Black Power and power to the people, and
Mhm.
quoting Chairman Mao
Yeah.
and the Red Book, things like that. But in all of that, there was still this thing of the numerical impossibility, even though we talked about asynchronous,
Sure.
engagement or warfare. The numerical reality pointed to, in a situation of violence, a capacity to commit genocide against a people, in
Mhm.
this case, our people. And to have that fear is not unreasonable.
Sure. And so
What
I'll
does
ask
history
you,
tell us? So,
yeah,
so,
I'll
so
ask you a question
mhm,
as someone, you were an adult during that time.
mhm,
And so I will ask you, when people were excited about Black Power,
mhm,
could they predict the war on drugs? Could they predict mass incarceration? Because we did not get mass incarceration until the 80s. And so
mhm,
this is what I mean with the backlash.
mhm,
You get, Brown versus Board, Rosa Parks, then you get Little Rock, Arkansas. Then after that, you get the March on Washington. Then you get the Civil Rights Act. You get the Voting Rights Act. You get the Black Panther Party. Um, and then you move into, the 70s, and after Woodstock, free love, all these things, Black people are thinking, okay, we're in our moment. And the
mhm.
next thing you know, Reagan declares his candidacy for presidency in Neshoba County, Mississippi, where the civil rights members were killed. And he's talking about making America great again, and wasn't even the first person to do it. Nixon said it before he did. People
Mhm.
think Trump invented this. And then as I'm coming of age, when I go to college, the Reagan Bush years were just Trump light. And so that's why I want us to, we can be optimistic, right? I want us to have hope, and I want us to
Mhm.
say that we're not going back. But I also want us to think about the fact that there's always been movement forward and movement back. And to prevent the movement back, we need to be prepared.
How do we prepare for that? What do we do? And the difference now, we've described the tools, the strategies used, the drug use, uh, the dismantling of voting rights movement, etc. The question now is, if Reagan and Bush were Trump light, what does Trump
Right.
itself mean? And what we have said is that a second time at the bat for Trump will not be a walk in the park. It'll be him having learned
Sure.
how to use the tools of power, and he's
Sure.
declared what he wants to do. So if he wins, how does it look, and how do we survive? But if he loses, and that triggers this repression or reaction that we experienced in various ways since Reconstruction, what do
Right.
we do?
Right. I think first and foremost, we have to be prepared.
Mhm,
So if people don't know the tenets of Project 2025, as I would say at McAllister, that is our homework, that is our assignment. He argued last night that he hadn't seen it, he had nothing to do with it. I think that people who are being honest with themselves realize that that is not true.
Mhm.
And the agenda for that has everything to do with infringing upon our rights as citizens. And I think that it's a playbook that people are going to try to execute regardless of who wins, right? Because the truth of the matter is, the pro life movement had been working behind the scenes for 5 decades. They were working
Mhm.
behind the scenes when Obama was president. I think that if people realized that Dobbs could have happened, Hillary might have won. So a lot of people do not realize the gender gap along race in terms of voting for Hillary. And what I mean by that is that 52% of white women voted for Trump. 94% of black women voted for Hillary.
Hmm.
I think more white women would have voted for Hillary if they had known that Dobbs was a possibility.
So now that they do know
Right.
that jobs has happened, we can count hopefully on them acting in ways that
Right.
reflect an understanding of women's interest, women's rights.
Right. And the thing about it is that even though we have had some challenging times, I think the important thing that we get out of this political movement or political moment is to understand how important it is to be informed. Right? And so I am not taking a position on, how people should behave politically, right? That's a
Mhm.
personal choice, and
Mhm.
that's a benefit of being a citizen in this country if you're 18 years old. But I think that if you have political behavior without information, that is dangerous. And I think we've learned the hard way.
I another thought. This is a pivot a little bit. This was the second time I heard the vice president talk about her intent as president to ensure, her words, that America had the most lethal fighting force in history.
Mhm.
And just to use the word lethal when I heard it the first time jumped out at me. And she went there again last night by
Sure.
declaring that her mission as commander in chief was to ensure that the fighting force she had was the most lethal force in the world. What does that mean? And what does it do for you? What does it mean for her? I think it signifies her acknowledgement of the awesome power of destruction that our military and that world militaries possess. And it reflects a fearlessness and the belief that we can manage having that capability, but not destroying the world.
Mhm.
But it's okay to have it, that in fact
Mhm.
we need it. What do you think?
I think this is partly about gender. And the reason why I say that is that one of the reasons why some Americans were hesitant around Hillary Clinton is just a discomfort with a woman being commander in chief, right?
Hmm.
There are left leaning Democrats that are not going to be pleased that she is so, pro empire, right? But I don't think there's any way in the world that a woman running for president of the United States cannot have a pro empire stance. If she would hold on to that, if she were elected, we can't really predict that. But I think in terms of a campaign strategy, that's really the only position she can have.
And so, on the question of empire, how does the question of empire fit into the notion of liberation for Black people in your mind? We've had an ongoing, look at our progress
Mhm,
from contact with the Europeans,
mhm,
enslavement, freedom from slavery,
mhm,
Jim Crow, and the struggles up to now. And a subset of that, two subsets. One is how do we make America ours in a way
right,
that it respects and we, benefit from it. Another subset is that we, in doing so, change how America lives up to these powerful and beautiful ideals. And if America does that, what difference and how different would the world be? And the third subset, this is mine, is that a difference between then and now is our capacity to be connected to each other in
Sure,
a global way that we haven't been
sure.
before. So, what are your thoughts?
I think that this is going to be the responsibility of Black citizens. And the reason why I say that is that in President Obama's first term, most Black Americans were hesitant to push him.
Mhm.
Black America was just so excited to have a Black president that we didn't demand to exist within the choices he had to make within empire. Um, if we go back and look at his presidency, and I teach a course on this, you will see that he does not talk about US race relations until his second term. And then in his second term, he acknowledges that if he'd had a son, his son would have looked like Trayvon Martin.
Mhm.
And so I think we need to be sophisticated in this moment that if Vice President Harris is elected, if we don't want to be casualties of, empire, right, then we need to push, right? And we need to push through mechanisms like the Congressional Black Caucus, but also through other mechanisms as well.
Roland Martin's show last night, featuring half a dozen members of the CBC, including Auntie Maxine Waters, and I think it was Jim Clyburn was there. I
Uh-huh.
think who else was there? Did you watch Roland Martin last night? Did you see
I,
it?
I did
Uh,
not.
also, what's Bobby's name from South Carolina? Um,
Or
but
Virginia? Are you talking about?
yeah, from Virginia, I think.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I can't think of his last name right
Yeah,
now, but uh, I see all the faces.
sure.
Uh, Barbara Lee from California and others. Um, but they talked about the critical role and Roland actually gave them huge praise and said that the public doesn't know the role they played in preventing other Democrats from bypassing Vice President Harris and
That's
submitting.
100% accurate. That is 100% accurate. If it weren't for the Congressional Black Caucus, we would have Gavin Newsom.
Talk
So
about that.
they did this.
What happened and how did it work? What's the behind
They
the scenes
they
story?
did this. I mean, part of it is, the utmost respect that we should have for Congressman Clyburn, right?
Mhm.
Congressman Clyburn said years ago that Black Americans needed to be appreciated for the role that we had played.
The other part of that is too often in our own community, we've heard them say, "What are they doing?" You
They're
know,
doing everything. They're doing
our
everything.
people deride uh, black leadership and criticize black leadership too often, right? And
They're
so,
doing everything.
and they're doing a lot, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think that if people really understood the influence that Black people have in politics, it's coming from Stacey Abrams, who doesn't even have an elected role, but has worked on voter suppression in Georgia. And then, in terms of if you think about the Senate, if you think about governors, you think about the Oval Office, the real power we've always had is in Congress because we've had numbers in Congress and they've been able to vote in a block and influence all of this. And so I think we need to be incredibly celebratory. And, your original question was, how do Black people not get left behind, even if Vice President Harris wins? And that is by paying close attention to the Congressional Black Caucus and making sure that they push for what would be best for most Black Americans.
And what's cool, Duchess Harris, is that this awareness about the power of the cohesive work, collaborative work of Congressional Black Caucus, we're seeing that really work out in Minnesota as well.
Exactly.
Uh, Black and BIPOC legislators have been instrumental in a massive transfer of opportunity and wealth to
Sure.
Black and other communities of color, and they're doing it with a sense of bravado and
Hmm.
confidence that
Hmm.
is necessary, and that
Hmm.
doesn't seek approval of white people. They're doing it because it's right. and
I
they're
mean, one of the
convincing.
things that I will close out on is that when Tim Walz was in Congress, he was representing rural Minnesota, where there are not
Mhm.
many people of color. When he became governor, it was the Black people on the ground in the metropolitan area, elected officials, it could be city council, state rep, state senator, or activists that made him have a certain kind of response once Philando Castile was killed. And so that was awakening to him. And so the power of you know, collective Black voices is what we need and has been useful in every capacity.
Duchess Harris, thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. Good to see you, my friend. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Duchess.
All
Take
right.
care.
Thanks for having me.
Bye bye.